Settled, as Michael said, my name's Wayne Collier. I'm the Industry Capability Manager at the Live for Export program. Today I'm joined by Patrick Underwood, Hamish Shannon and Matthew Reid from NACC, and we're going to cover off on market access and regulation, so two important issues for the livestock export industry. But to try and break up, I guess, the presentations and get down to some practicalities, we're going to try and avoid just presenting on the overview of what is ASEL, what is ESCAS, and try and get the commercial guys here to talk through what they do and how they actually roll out in practice. So I'm going to pass over to Patrick to introduce his team and what they're hoping to get out of the presentation today.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Firstly, it's great to be here. I grew up as a producer in the Northern Territory out on River and Station. I've worked for the Northern Territory Livestock Exporters Association, Meat and Livestock Australia, and now I'm a livestock exporter, so I've seen most sides of the fence, I guess you could say. Speaking to Michael Finucane and Wayne, we just thought it'd be good. It's a reasonably dry presentation, I guess, if you're just sitting here going through the rules and regulations. So the idea of having our guys here is just to give you a commercial focus of what actually happens on a day-to-day basis as a livestock exporter. So we'll give you some of the challenges and some of the issues we face. So just introducing my guys, on my right is Hamish Shannon. So he's the operations manager for NACC. His job is to basically put all the cattle on the ship in a timely manner, which sounds simple, but it's not. And to his right is Matt Reid. He's our ESCAS and animal welfare manager. Matt regularly tells Hamish and myself that he's the most important bloke in the office, because unless we have ESCAS and supply chain, we can't do our job. So anyway, that's a bit of an overview of who we are.
Thanks, Patrick. So we'll the first topic we've got today is market access. And as Michael covered, it's a time now where there is quite a bit happening and there's quite a bit of opportunity. So I suppose we're coming from a place where we are getting outcomes at the moment. So got one slide just to give a bit of context before we start talking about what it means in practice. And I suppose for the livestock export industry, because you're talking about livestock, you're talking about market access relies on a health protocol. So to actually get the animals over there, you have to have an agreement between the two countries that sets out the conditions that the importing country requires for you to basically that need to be met by the exporter, by the animals themselves in Australia, and then certified by the Australian government. Those are the conditions that need to be met if the country is going to allow the importation. So I think market access, when I think about it, it's really about the importation of animals as much as it is about the exportation. So basically when you go into something like a negotiation, you're really looking at trying to get two outcomes. And one's to get a recognition of Australia's excellent health status. So while we have a good idea of what we're free of, we need to communicate those and explain them and substantiate those to our trading partners. The other side of it is you need to make sure that the requirements that do remain in there are practical, costly, and they have to align with the processes that are in place in the current export supply chain, so that you're aligning treatments and tests with when you're having animals in, bringing them into the RP or the registered premise or taking them out. So when we approach it, they're the key areas, I guess, where there's obviously a need to bring in a lot of commercial information to pull those bits together and clearly get something that these guys can actually do and take them from the farm and put them on the vessel and take them across successfully. While we obviously hope to get a good recognition of our health status and get those things agreed, then they're not always perfect. It is a negotiation, so you do end up with things that don't necessarily always make sense. They may be more costly, there may be tests that we don't think are necessary, or things where you do have to, I guess, introduce a new husbandry or handling just to meet those requirements. But once it's agreed, those things make it workable and make the trade happen, and once it's agreed, they just need to be met. So what does it mean though? So, Patrick, Mark, I guess starting generally, what's market access mean to an exporter?
Well, clearly, obviously, we need access to a market. So it's fundamental. And I guess just going back to protocols, unless we have those agreed protocols, we don't have the framework to operate, between the two governments. For us as an exporter, it's just very important that firstly that we understand the protocol and they're clear, because once we understand and they're clear and they're workable, then we can cost them, and obviously it's very important as an exporter that we can build in the cost of these protocols. So I guess just as an example of where there can be some grey areas with protocols is with for example with BJD, with bovine Johne's disease, there's two different tests at the moment. And I know that this is an upcoming research project which will be good, but there's two different tests. You can use the ELISA test or the CFT test, and one of them seems to give a lot more reactors than the other, which in effect knocks a whole lot more cattle out of your shipment. It seems in young cattle it's not an accurate test in any instance, but this is just one example as an exporter of where we'd obviously be preferring to use the CFT test. As an example, last year we did a shipment to Vietnam and we had something like 260 reactors using the ELISA test, and the Berrima lab up here ran the test using the CFT technology, and there's only 12 reactors. So that's just an example of how testing is very important.
So Patrick, those 260 head, what did that cost, those getting knocked out of the consignment?
I guess there's costs of, it takes time. Obviously you've got vet fees, time in yards, hay, etc. But one of the costs is what you do with the reactors and what you do with the rejects, and that's one of the things that's always been the problem in the north in particular, is that once they get off the farm and get into a quarantine facility, there's little you can do with them, especially if there is a sort of a stigma attached that they've reacted positive to a test. So in the east, we put them back through a abattoir. We do have that option up here now, but obviously when you've got smaller cattle, 300 kilos, there's not a particular high demand for them in abattoirs.
So you've touched on testing and false positives and dealing with those. In terms of the protocols themselves, obviously there's a whole range of factors that go into them: tests, treatments, quarantine periods. When we come out through the protocol committee, which I'll go through in a minute, sort of seeking your advice on a new protocol, or you get an import permit, what are you looking for in those? What are the key elements that you see for cost or delays or issues when you're pulling something together?
I just like the protocols reflect the risks. I think there's potential with new markets that they try and safeguard against every single disease all the time. So we rely on vets and obviously experts and government officials to work these things through on a practical basis. I think one of the really pleasing things is the fact that Biosecurity Australia, as a government department, are so happy to engage in these new markets. And it's just tremendous to see these new markets that are opening up. They've made a huge difference. If you look at Vietnam, for example, what that's done for the price of slaughter cattle and slaughter bulls out of northern Australia is it's unbelievable. Those prices are right up there, and in fact sometimes exceeding feeder cattle, which was unheard of 2 or 3 years ago before Vietnam. A 380 kilo steer was almost useless. It could not go to Indonesia, and it was a hell of a long way back to Eastern Australia, and you just sort of had to hope someone had a boat going to Malaysia or the Philippines, and you'd get a 50-cent discount on what was probably the better animal in the yard, because it had the breeding and the genetics to be 380 kilos over its brothers that were 350 kilos, and you're getting 50 cents less for it. So that's the importance of having a range of markets that can take a range of cattle.
Yep. So I think obviously the next question we'll get to in a minute, which is what happens after you do get access, what's the next step. But I think one of the things that we've been talking about and on biosecurity and the successes that we have been having lately, and I think it's important just to run through the structures that we have and how they've changed over the last, I suppose, 5-10 years. So it's a bit of a busy slide, but I guess the purpose of this is just to show historically we've had you have a lot of individual agendas, obviously, in the commercial industry, and you've only got limited resources within the Department of Agriculture. So negotiations have to happen at the federal level, and you've only got a certain number of people who can do that. Now, you need to have those resources working on your priorities, and in the past we've had lots of different agendas pushing them to their priority, which doesn't necessarily align with the overall benefits that might come to the industry as a whole. And it just ends up with poorer allocation and poorer outcomes. So, prior to my time, but some clever heads basically decided that there was a need to bring together a much more streamlined, coordinated process where there was stronger communication and better channels between the industry and exporters and the Australian government. There was a better partnership working towards the goals in alignment, and also that putting the dedicated expertise towards assisting that and pushing it forward and helping to expand that resource capacity outside of the government, so you had industry and government both with the ability to get into it. So to carry that forward, we set up the Livestock Export Protocol Committee through ALEC and LiveCorp and the LEP, and it's made up of exporter representatives, peak councils, service bodies and the Department of Agriculture. And its key role is to set the priorities, so bring all the ideas that these guys have for markets, bring it all together, discuss it, identify using a pretty sensible assessment of what's the likelihood of success against what's the benefit if we are successful, and then prioritise those into the industry's priorities. So the department and the LEP as well knows where its resources should be directed, so that we are focusing on things like China. There's been decade work or more on China because it's been identified as a priority for a long time, and a number of the other markets have been there obviously as they've developed, and the ones that have been agreed recently have all been prioritised through the Protocol Committee. And to support that, we've got the LEP putting committed resources to underpin that as the Secretariat and technical support. So this is basically the idea is that now it all gets funneled into one basket. You have one communication channel to the government, and there's very clear priorities, and we get better results out of it. This is just touching on what the LEP does. I suppose the other side of it is we do a lot of work in terms of delegations and coordinating and supporting the government in bringing groups out here, and we do a lot of that with the state governments, and certainly the NT government's done a lot recently with delegations we've brought up through here, particularly from Indonesia and China. And they're important in getting people face to face and giving the opportunity for industry to put forward their views, show the supply chain, and to get the government from our side and the importing country governments able to sit down and talk through issues. This is, last year and a half, these are, the green ones are protocols that have been finalised, and the orange ones, I guess, are discussions that have been ongoing for quite a while. So I think you can see that there's quite a few markets in there. They're not all, some of them are smaller markets like Philippines, breeders, sheep and goats, but you've got China, feeder slaughter cattle, you've got Lebanon, Egypt, Bahrain, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam there was a protocol already, but it's expanded. And you've got discussions going on with Myanmar, the US and Mexico. So I think it sends a good message, I think, that there is opportunity out there, and it has happened quite quickly, and there's obviously that demand and driving influence globally. So to move back to talking to these guys again, I guess once you get access, it's not just all about regulation and protocols. There's a whole commercial side that needs to be dealt with. So what happens, Patrick, once you've got a protocol? What do you then get onto?
Well, then we try and do some business, which I've got to tell you is quite difficult at the moment. I guess, it's not often talked about, but most of the business dealings that I do are in market. We go up there and visit our customers, in their feedlots, at their place of business. And I think the most important thing for producers to recognise is, how big these businesses are up there and how sophisticated they are. And they've got a sales program that's, it might be 150 head a day, every day of the year. So these guys want to know when their ships are coming, how many are on them, and obviously then we discuss the price and the terms, etc. But it's just the important point is that we're just not just operating, selling ships randomly. We're up there discussing with them. So in the case of Indonesia, we're normally up there sort of 6 weeks before a quarter and discussing things for that following quarter. It's interesting talking to some of our customers last night. It looks like Indonesia is moving towards this annual permit basis, which will obviously be a really great thing, very good for the industry, for both the importers, exporters, and of course you as producers. So we understand that by the middle of December there'll be a figure will come out for the following 12 months, and then they'll be delivered monthly, not quarterly, but there will be a figure for the year. I discussed before about the price. There's increasing issues in all our markets with the price of Australian cattle at the moment. It costs a lot of money to charter a vessel and all the costs associated with it to deliver those cattle at a CIF price. I think the most important thing there is to do things as efficiently as we can. So it's very important that we bring cattle in here. And Hamish, of course, will talk about a little around ASEL and doing that, getting them on the ship, and just getting good cattle through the system as efficiently as we can. But it's a very important thing. It allows, we need to be operating 2 and 3 months in advance. It gives us time to purchase the right cattle and get everything in place. So I guess I'll pass on to Hamish from here, and he can just talk a little about.
Can I just add something there as the self-appointed most important person in the office?
So here he goes.
That in conjunction with the commercial process, we also run our ESCAS in line with that commercial process. So although ESCAS today will come later on in this forum, ESCAS is actually being run the whole time from when we actually start negotiations with a client in the country. ESCAS is at the forefront of what we do.
Yep. I suppose one of the questions, I mean, we've got, obviously there's been a few markets open up, and market access can take a long time. When something, and the ideas obviously come from exporters, once that starts, when do you start engaging in the country, talking to customers, looking for customers?
Look, I think with the complexity of live exports, we would prefer to deal with less better customers. So of course in new markets you're going to find new customers, but until you, what Matt's saying is absolutely right. I mean, you can't do business unless they have a supply chain. To have a supply chain, they need to have good feedlots, good abattoirs that need to be independently audited and checked off, and and then the Australian government has to approve that supply chain. So I guess concurrently you can talk commercially, but there's no point. You can't do any deals until that's been done.
Problems. So I think that takes us through market access and moving on now to regulation. And just before I'll pass over to Hamish in a minute to take us through basically how ASEL, the Australian Standards for Export Livestock, how they work in practice. But I guess just to very quickly, give a bit of context. Obviously, the livestock export industry, as Michael pointed out earlier, is a heavily regulated industry. It's regulated, especially through the feeder slaughter side of things, from the farm in Australia through to the point of slaughter in market. And there's two basic sets of standards and systems that underpin that, and that's the Australian Standards for the Export of Livestock, which apply from the farm through to basically when the ship arrives or the plane arrives at the destination, and then ESCAS, the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, which runs from once those animals are discharged or discharge itself through the point of slaughter, including animal handling. So ASEL, Collier. So ASEL is a 100-page set of standards, animal welfare standards, setting out a range of things. I mean, one of the key, things through it is fitness to export. There's a pretty consistent focus on removing animals that aren't suited to it or that have disease or parasites. But at each stage, there's general animal welfare requirements covering preparation and sourcing, land transport, quarantine on the vessel, preparation for the vessel, all the way to that point. So obviously Hamish is in charge of actually taking these animal welfare standards and integrating them into the business, integrating them into the commercial side of things, and integrating that into the protocol. So that all sounds pretty simple, Hamish. So what do? You get it all?
I guess at the start, how do we ensure that everyone in our supply chain understands ASEL? So we get all our cattle agents to sign a request to source to supply livestock to NACC, And the request to source is pretty much just saying that the agent has read and understood ASEL, all the steps from land transport all the way through to on-farm selection as well. We also send out to our yards, trucks and vets another booking note which pretty much says they have read ASEL as well and understand all the steps that they're meant to do during the process. So once Patrick hands me a contract, obviously I need to get an import permit and a health protocol from the country we're going to. I have to read the protocol, make sure that we're going to be ticking all the steps off, and then I have to go on the Australian Government Department of Agriculture website, which is TRACE, Truck Animal Certification for Export. In this, I have to add what importer we're going to, whatever country, to premises, which is a registered premises wherever we are shipping out of what port in Australia. Description of livestock, if it's breeder cattle, buffalo, camels, whatever it is. Land transport, so I have to put in here, there's the what ship we're using, roughly what port we're going to ship out of, a rough date, and what trucks we're going to be using in Australia. So, for example, Road Trains Australia. I also have to add in here what vet I'll be using at each yard, so I could be using multiple yards to truck out of, and I could have multiple vets. I also have to upload a lot of documentation, so I upload the import permits, health certificates, a crimp, which is the consignment risk management plan. And once all them are entered into TRACE, I get a LNC number. And this LNC number goes with this shipment the whole way through. So if the Australian government comes back to us with a question, or even Matt with ESCAS, they say LNC number 802, and we know exactly what boat it was, where it left Australia, and what port it went to overseas.
So with you're talking about, you've got your consignment risk management plan, which I guess just to expand it, that's basically a table or a document that sets out what steps you're going to take to meet each of the health requirements. So every clause in the health requirement, and basically how you're going to meet ASEL for that particular export, and you do that for each consignment. And when do you have to put that in? You've got your notice of intention to export, your crimp. What are the? Yeah,
so I have to put the crimp in a minimum 10 days prior to the vessel leaving Australia. And as Wayne said, I have a different crimp for every country: a breeder consignment, a slaughter consignment, a feeder cattle to Indonesia. Every crimp's different to match the health requirements for each country. And then from there, once everything's entered into TRACE, we obviously trying to purchase our cattle contracts. So on-farm selection is a very big, important one in ASEL. All cattle have to meet ASEL standards, so obviously they have to have a fat score of 2+, no visible disease, no blindness, no lameness. The heifers have to be preg tested empty, unless it's a breeder consignment. They can be up to 6 months in calf. They also have to have horns less than 12 centimetres. If the horns are more than 12 centimetres, we have to put 30% extra space on the ship, which obviously costs us a fair bit of money. And also, even in trucking and stuff, you have to truck all the horn cattle separate and then pen them separate on the vessel, plus the 30% extra space.
To just give you an example of horns, you're just talking some loose figures, but it might cost $150 US a square metre from Townsville to Ho Chi Minh City. That's a square metre, so a 500 kilo slaughter steer will need 1.79 square metres. So basically, that might cost you $270 US to send that animal on that ship. So we're being asked to give animals that have got their horns are 4 centimetres longer than they should be in ASEL. That animal has to be given an extra 30% space on the ship, which is an extra $90 US we have to pay to ship an animal that's got horns 4 centimetres longer than ASEL. So when you get exporters whinging about horns, it's for a pretty good reason. So get the dehorners out.
And so obviously you're inspecting as on exit from the farm and then on entry into the registered premise. What happens if the animals don't meet ASEL? What happens if they're not meeting these specs? Where do they go?
So mainly our agents reject the cattle on farm. If the animals actually do turn up at the registered premises, we inspect them at the registered premises, and then we would probably do a draft on them, and then also we have to get the Australian government vet, the local regional vet, to come and inspect the cattle 24 hours prior to export. So there's a big chance that they could reject the animals also if they're lame, blind, there's tick on them, so they'll reject the animals and the animals cannot go for export.
Just going to ask, do you have a feedback mechanism for your producers on the performance or how they perform coming into the yards?
Yeah, we call them up and say, come and get your cattle. That's one way. Yeah, look, we try to. The other important feedback is actually from in-market as well. So we're trying to work more and more with that. We're having long conversations about this last night, but to get some feedback from how cattle are performing in feedlots, both good and bad, back to exporters firstly and then back to producers is increasingly important, and I think it's able to happen more and more now with technology. One of the things we like is to get some good feedback back, because a lot of people ring up when you've got a problem, or when there's a particular lot of heifers that have there's been too many that have actually turned out to be pregnant in market. There's obviously some issues back here in Australia with that we need to look into. So it is important to get that feedback back, but we could probably do it better. Everyone could do it better, I believe.
So I think the next step, Hamish will work his way through all these now, but Hamish, obviously I think the key is there's a lot of documentation you have to put together in the process. Which one, I suppose, which ones of these are the key ones that cause you the biggest challenges?
So yeah, on the documentation side, every shipment that we send over, it'd be a folder probably about this fat, with full documentation, government documentation, to vendor declarations, pregnancy certificates, way bills. Probably the biggest ones I'm always chasing or are wrong are the declarations from property, the vendor declarations, the pregnancy certificates. So many pregnancy certificates have got the wrong date on. So the pregnancy certificate's meant to be within 30 days of export, and if the preg tester is outside of that, obviously the cattle can't go unless you re-preg test in yards. And we've had that on numerous occasions. So many way bills, NVDs are being filled in wrong, which the Australian government will pin me on. I have to go back to the producer, fill them incorrectly, and it's just time consuming. We're trying to load a boat an hour out and we're still waiting for vendor decks and pregnancy certificates and everything to turn up. So it just holds up the whole consignment, the whole shipment.
So you mentioned then you've got things coming in close to the shipment. You've only got 10 days where you start getting this stuff together. So
yeah,
how does that flow through?
We try to bring cattle in 4 days out. 4 days out. The minimum is 24 hours in quarantine for Indonesia. Obviously, if you're doing a breeder consignment, it's 14 days. But bringing cattle in for 4 days prior to your shipment, everything's paperwork could be rushed because agents could be driving to another job and is on the road, not near a fax or a printer. So it's quite hard that way. And this is some of the documentation that I do for every consignment. That's only about half of what I do. Individual weights to go to export to Indonesia. Obviously, we have to individual weigh every animal, which is to just show the Australian government that the cattle under 350 kilos. Cattle inspection.
So you have to weigh them and list the weights against.
So I have to individual weigh every animal and then match it up with the RFID for each property.
And that has to go into the government before they'll approve the export.
Yeah.
So I think you've got some slides here with some of the documents.
So this is one of our checklists in the office. We have numerous of checklists, but this is one. This is an 82-point checklist that we have to tick off for every shipment. Just runs through pretty much everything, every documentation that we need. Who do we need to send to? What we need to collect, all that kind of stuff. ASEL on the vessel is probably one of the most important parts. So I send a load plan to the vessel, which pretty much states what order of the livestock are going to arrive to the vessel. So it'll be, for example, slaughter steers will be first on 1,600 head, and they might average 500 kilos. The next one, heifers, 400 kilos. And I hand that to the ship. The ship does a load plan, which you'll see later in the next slide, and it will say so many head in so many each pen, so everyone knows, yeah, that's the cargo plan. You probably can't really read it, but in there's a number in each pen. So those are all your decks. Your green deck's your bottom deck, and as you work your way up. So you probably can't see, but right in that down the bottom corner, it says deck 1, class feeder heifers, 499, average weight 316 kilos. So that's what's going to be arriving first, and then they'll work the way up the decks.
No worries. So I think wrap up, I suppose, the ASEL side of things, and give ourselves a little bit of a plug for some of the R&D work. Mentioned before the fact you have to get booking notes and you get your agents and your service providers to sign off that they understand ASEL. One of the things that, I suppose it's actually been a few years from concept to delivery, but we've developed an ASEL app which is freely available. It's this document turned into a free thing that you get on your phone and you can scan through, search. It has calculators for the amount of fodder, water, space requirements, all those sorts of things. So we've just released that last week, and I encourage you all to get on your the App Store and download it. But I mean, I suppose one of the purposes, communication of ASEL is in regulation is one of the most important, but one of the most difficult things. In terms of, it is a dry thing, and turning 100 pages of standards into something that people, I think the next one, turning that into that rejection criteria list into something that's practical. This is a bit of an old document that we've produced, but turning into things that then communicate out and make it a bit more accessible to people who actually have to apply the regulation in practice. There's a bit too many sheep ones there, but so I think that basically takes us on to ESCAS now, and I won't go into too much detail because Matt's going to take us through what makes him the most important man in the business, I think. So obviously it covers the whole supply chain over there for feed to slaughter livestock. There's 4 key elements to ESCAS. You've got your animal welfare standards. So there's about, I think, 32 animal welfare standards which are set out by the Australian government. There's control and traceability requirements which require you to be able to trace your animals through the system and ensure they remain in an approved, ESCAS approved abattoir feedlot. You have to conduct independent third-party audits on a frequency determined by the government using the checklists and the standards that they've got. And then you've got to report back to the department, and there's obviously the approval and ongoing performance monitoring that goes through that department process. But I think ESCAS is probably best explained with the practical terms. So, Matt, do you want to take us through?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So, the practicalities of ESCAS is basically with those first 2 points there. We can see government ESCAS regulation, which happens basically here in Australia. So, establishing supply chains, varying supply chains, all the associated documentation that goes to the department for approval of our supply chains. It's just the paperwork trail that we initially follow. ESCAS basically happens in market, working with our importers, our feedlots, and in our abattoirs to ensure that compliance, and that's the bottom line, is that we're compliant to the regulations. And this all starts in the early stages with basically training and risk mitigation. So huge amounts of training go into supply chains in animal handling, welfare. This is where the LEP plays a major role, providing consultants to help us with this training in markets. And that way that everyone understands ESCAS fully and the requirements that they need to follow under ESCAS. And it's interesting with markets and as they mature, and as we've seen in Indonesia, is that they take ownership of ESCAS. Initially, when it was put in, there was, I dare to say, a fair reluctance over ESCAS, but over time, it's a system that they've embraced to the point now that we'll have importers that employ animal welfare people. That they train their own staff now, so they've had trainers that have been trained up into areas that capabilities to be able to train their own staff through their own supply chains. So those sort of advancements, I suppose, is one of the benefits.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, just by virtue of the fact that you're talking about one of the things that obviously has happened as well is that within export companies there's dedicated resources here, like yourself, looking after ESCAS, looking after the compliance and all these bits and pieces that prior to the regulation coming in obviously wasn't there. So it's a new bum on the seat. So
just on that, Wayne, you'll see a couple more of the red shirt brigade over there. So George Black is our in-country Vietnam manager. To his left, or his right in fact, is Thuy. She's our local Vietnamese lady up there in the marketplace. And on George's left is Pak Puja, who works for Global Compliance, where he looks after our supply chains in Indonesia. So, as well as a team in Australia, we've certainly got teams in market working hard on these things.
So in what you were saying, Wayne, is absolutely correct. It's changed the way we do business. So basically prior, I suppose it was more of a sales focus. Now I'd like to think that it's ESCAS followed by sales. We'll have disagreements on that. So, but basically they work together. So we've got to have everything established, training in place, all the procedures in place with our ESCAS, and that all is in conjunction with sales. So, I mean, basically a couple of weeks ago we were all sitting across the table with a Vietnamese company and discussing sales and ESCAS at the same time for a new company that wants to establish in Vietnam. So they're the sort of things that previously wouldn't have gone through. Investment challenges are that it is an expense. There's no doubt. And as every exporter has, they've put in a lot of money into animal welfare throughout supply chains. And as you said before, employment, ESCAS has enabled people like me to be in these sorts of positions with companies, and in market we employ a large number of people. We also use a traceability company, Global Compliance, who also run our traceability, who also employ a large number of people. So basically the expansion of people working in welfare within these exporter companies is huge, and every exporter has a large contingent of people working in markets and in these areas.
Just on the cost as well, I think correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I think we've put about 92 stun guns into Vietnam at the moment.
101.
101, sorry. And they're about $1,500 a pop, so it's a massive expense, as Matt was talking about.
And obviously, how's it changed the relationships? Obviously, you now are getting involved in the supply chains over there. You extending the relationships. There's more time spent building, extending your supply chains.
Yeah, look, we spend a lot of time in market working with our importers and their supply chains, and in doing that, an important part of these supply chains is distribution. So we try as much as we can to work closely with them, and especially with new clients, is making sure prior to they start investing huge amounts of money into building feedlots and abattoirs and whatever, is that what is their distribution going to be, and how are they going to distribute their product.
Yep.
So some of the benefits, and they're pretty obvious, the benefits of ESCAS, and I think it just comes down to improved efficiencies. So with ESCAS, and if we take Indonesia as an example, we've got a large percentage of, most of the facilities there are now stun facilities. With all the animal handling training, they've improved their efficiencies. ESCAS provides a framework which has helped with all the training in handling and whatever for better outcomes in human welfare, let alone animal welfare. So there's been great advancements in there. And look, I've said it before, and I've said it to a number of people, that I can go into any feedlot in Indonesia basically and see animal handling as good as you'll see anywhere. And in my earlier days, prior to this position, I was a consultant with MLA, and it was really interesting, the fact that you could go in and do animal handling training in Indonesia, and then they'd show you YouTube footage of what happens in Australia, and they'd wonder why we were making them do certain things when they'd be able to show you other things that were happening in Australia. And the answer we'd give them was, well, you may as well learn best practice and be better. So, over time it took a long time to work through that. The fact that what we can now see in these countries is some pretty good handling and pretty good things. Same with infrastructure, improved infrastructure. So people are going through facilities all the time. If we take Vietnam as an example, there's a lot of shared facilities between exporters. Most of those facilities would have someone visiting there at least once or twice a week, due to the number of exporters and people on the ground. And their infrastructure is improving continually. Traceability. Look, it's just good business. We know where our cattle are. I mean, it's as simple as that. It also enables us to have feedback, that feedback we were talking about earlier, that as animals go out, that feedback can come back from the abattoirs, and then we can relay that feedback back through the supply chain.
So we might just flick on to some of the next slides so that we leave a little bit of time for questions in a minute.
No worries.
But, so do you want to talk through...
Yeah, look, I'll quickly, as we're obviously running out of time. Global compliance, run our technology. I won't go into specifics, but basically it's high-tech stuff that we scan our animals and it pings all around the world to a control room in Jakarta. And in that control room, it's manned 24/7, and we know exactly what's going on in the facility. So basically it's a remote data acquisition. We've also got backup contingency in that system. That's the box that we have in our camera. Now, if we move on to the next slide, Wayne. So basically, I've got a good working relationship with Pak Puja. My family does not like Pak Puja as much as I do. That's due to the fact that I'll get text messages in the middle of the night with such pictures as this. So this is a spider web over a camera in our facility, in one of our facilities that we needed to get removed in the middle of the night. So we have 3 countries all on the phone getting these sort of things sorted. The next example of the technology picking up, we had someone place a plastic bag over a camera. So again, in the middle of the night, Pak Puja's on the texting and waking up everyone, and we get out and sort it out. And basically behind this one was in the next slide, it's where one of the workers actually has his bath. So since then we've made different arrangements so that we're not actually capturing him and worrying too much about when he has his shower. So these are the sort of things that we're picking up with our technology. We pick up a lot of other things that we fix up, and in reality, the traceability systems, and there's a couple out there, and they're all capturing data. They're all doing the things that we want. They're evolving the technologies that global compliance for us and and other exporters. So Frontier and ILE both use global compliance. We all work in together at times to help improve the systems and work with global compliance strongly to improve those systems. But the new technologies are going to be outstanding. So basically they'll be fully automated and we won't have to rely on human interaction to run our traceability systems.
Yeah, so, and I think that one of the big messages out of that is, I think a couple of years ago CCTV was just a camera sitting there. Now it's reading tags, and I think it's just that rapid advancement and the opportunities that technology and innovation, of what you guys are using, offer to the industry to get this happening more efficiently and effectively. So, I think very quickly, you mentioned before the LEP. We get involved with ESCAS. One of the key roles is having consistent, basic, standardised rollout materials. So things like SOPs, training for handling and slaughter in overseas markets to try and build implementation, but also encourage exporters and importers to adopt those into their systems. Michael noted before, one of the issues is that regulation's never perfect, and there are some duplicative processes in the regulation at the moment, and while you can't necessarily always change it straight away, you've got to find ways, and these are just some templates to try and streamline it so that you're not having the same things assessed over and over again, or there's a more efficient way to get it done. So I think we're pretty much wrapping up now, but this is just the other side of it, which is there is a whole lot of work that goes into actually working and doing research and analysis into regulation and into the inefficiencies in regulation and the opportunities to improve the actual the standards themselves, the systems that implement those standards, all the structures around it, and there's a lot of money involved when you do have duplication, and I think we've talked about it before, but there is duplication in audits over in ESCAS. It's on a supply chain basis, so each exporter has to get audits. In Australia, it got changed recently, but basically every time you put in a consignment plan, you had to get your ESCAS approved. It was the same supply chain. You had to get it approved over and over again because of the way the legislation was structured. And the Australian government changed that and split that up, and that's meant cost savings and, realistically, removing frustration of having to do the same thing over and over again. So there's a few things like that, and I guess that brings it through to basically the questions. But over to Mike.
Yeah, so we'll open the floor up, and we've got a few minutes for questions. So if you've got any questions of Wayne and what the live export program does, or the commercial operators here. Everyone's keen for coffee.
This is not a question, but a statement. But there's obviously a number of exporters and their full teams here over the day. So, and also global compliance has got their stand out there, and they've got their latest technology is that they can scan and pick up tags from 10 metres away now. So you can sort of stand above a truck and just wave this thing and pick up all the animals on it, or walk down a feedlot and pick up tag numbers from sort of 10 metres away. So just encourage you. Some people don't like asking questions on a floor like this, but just come along and talk to us over the next couple of days, and I'm happy to answer all your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So, look, I think we might wrap that up, Wayne, and thank the guys. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, one question. Hang on.
Paul McCormick, Matt, how are you going? We recognise your good work.
Yeah,
I thought it'd be worth... I've certainly got a question that I get asked in the field a lot, and it's about leakage and the perceptions of leakage. When we hear leakage reported in the press, I think our minds immediately go to the worst case scenario and what gets displayed on commercial newspapers. But my understanding is that that is such a small percentage of leakage, and I was wondering if you could comment about leakage A and leakage B, and what your thoughts are, and how better we could report that to industry.
Thanks, Paul. Look, leakage indefinitely in some markets does happen, but rest assured that exporters with their traceability systems are working extremely hard to ensure that that does not happen. So basically, it's something that everyone is working extremely hard. We've put in 6-point plans. We've put in new systems to eliminate any further leakage that might have happened previously, and these systems are starting to take effect. And now, as we move forward, I'd say that leakage now is starting to be minimal in these markets.
But it has occurred. People are being caught for it. Like the one good thing was that all the exporters went up there together once, twice, and then a third time to sit down with importers in Vietnam and explain these things to them. Say, listen, you guys have got to get this right because it's not good enough. Producers in Australia and the Australian public expect cattle to stay in your supply chains, and that's when we individually sat down with every importer up there, and every exporter signed off on the same piece of paper, which is pretty rare in the export industry, that you see every exporter getting together to working in a unified fashion on that. So once that was sort of put in place, and when there has been instances of leakages, we've written our self-reports to the Australian government. We've been up front. The Australian government's assessed those reports, and we've suspended a number of importers and a number of facilities, and they've been suspended across the whole industry. So other exporters are told that those importers are out, those facilities are out, and no one wants to go to them, and that's a 6-month automatic suspension. So I just think it's worth noting that it's not something we're shirking away from. It's not something it's not something that the Australian government's shirking from. We recognise that new markets, there's going to be these challenges in front of us, but the good thing is, as Matt said, the technology is there now to make sure and to catch offenders out, so we can deal with them. So it's just getting easier on that aspect. And
I think, Paul, that one of the main aspects of this is the fact that in a market like Vietnam, it's only it's very new. It's a couple of years old. ESCAS is a new thing. It's a slaughter market, so it's a different market to, say, Indonesia, which is well over 20 years of exports to Indonesia. So they're different markets, different aspects, and different things we've got to work through in these markets to ensure that we can keep everything compliant. Hence the dramatic advances in the technologies to help exporters get these things under control.
Thanks, guys. So, look, I'd like to thank the team from NACC. It's great to have a commercial operator giving experience about what's happening in the market, and hopefully you got to learn something about the supply requirements and the ESCAS requirements in the industry. Thank you. So, you guys jump off. And just...